Okay. So we were talking about the skin as an organ, and the skin also has a series of glands that are associated with it. And there's actually two different categories of glands. And so the first category is called sudoriferous glands. So that's the first category. And this includes glands that produce sweat. So under this category, we have what are called Exocrine glands. And these produce true sweat. And so we talked about how important that is in thermoregulation. And we also talked about the components of the sweat. So it contains water, but it also contains, sometimes it can be acidic in nature, so it can contain acidity, but it has some immune system functions. Remember, we talked about how it has antibodies and antibacterial properties. Okay. So the eccrine glands are located pretty much everywhere. I guess one place that they're not located would be like in your lips or in the areolar, the nipple region of your body, but the sweat glands tend to be widely distributed over the body. Okay. So if we look at another type of sudoriferous glands, we can say that we have apocrine glands. And these are glands that have a specialized function, and they're only found in like the genital regions and also in the armpit region. So any regions where there's like hair, so the genital, armpit regions. And they tend to become functional at puberty. So obviously, because of the puberty connection, they think that the apocrine glands may function in producing pheromones. So may produce pheromones. There's actually quite a bit of controversy. We know that pheromones are important in other mammals. It's a big means of communication, where we release chemicals that influence the behavior of other individuals. But it's kind of controversial to say that we are influenced by pheromones. However, we do seem to have little receptors, little pit receptors in our nasal cavity that might be able to detect that. And we are kind of, it's been shown that we are either attracted to particular smells, or we tend to be repelled by particular smells. And so if you look at things like Jovan musk, which is a type of perfume or cologne that people sometimes wear, that actually contains pheromones of a boar, right? And so we think that maybe we are picking up on those pheromones. When we look at pheromones, one of the functions is that they allow us to choose mates that are genetically different than we are. So we tend to be sexually attracted to individuals that are very genetically different, and that is actually a mechanism that allows for outbreeding, so that you're not going to mate with somebody that has your similar genetic components, and then therefore you will actually produce more diverse offspring. Okay? But the apocrine glands kind of produce an oily, protein-rich substance. So this is a secretion. And this is what bacteria feed upon and produce body odor. So it's the apocrine glands. The bacteria feed on the secretions. Right? And this is what produces body odor. Now, there's some controversy over using excessive soap, for example, to get rid of bacteria in general. So, like, for example, using my antimicrobial soap is now kind of thought to be in general, kind of thought to be a bad thing. And there is some evidence that if you wash excessively, right, your apocrine glands actually become more active, and then you'll actually be dependent upon using deodorants and other things to kind of mask. But if you have good bacteria and not the bacteria that causes the body odor, perhaps you'll actually smell better without using products. So sometimes products like overbathing and overusing of deodorant can actually make your body odor worse because you're killing off the good bacteria, and then your body produces more oily substance, and then you get bad bacteria creating body odor. Okay. So the Europeans kind of understand this, right? They don't bathe nearly as much as us Americans, right? And that's one of the reasons why they don't stink so bad. Or maybe they do stink, I don't know, but they don't think they stink. Okay, so those, the other one, sudoriferous glands, would be the mammary glands. And these are believed to be modified sweat glands. Right? So the mammary glands are present in both males and females, but they're only active in females due to the production of prolactin, which is a hormone that causes them to start to secrete. So this is the secretion of milk to feed the newborns. So the other categorization of glands is sebaceous gland. Right. And one example of sebaceous glands, oh, I forgot to mention one, sorry, up here. In our ear, our outer ear, we have cerumen glands, or ceruminous glands. And this produces ear wax, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay. So ear wax is actually called cerumen. And sometimes you see this more often, like in children, like little babies, you know, they get this yellow gunk coming out of their ears. And that is actually earwax. And that actually is believed to have a protective property in that it has lots of antibacterial properties to it. And it is kind of naturally moves out by itself out of the ear canal. Although sometimes it gets stuck in there and then you have to kind of go into the doctor and they have to syringe it out maybe with hot water to try to remove any earwax that gets stuck in the ear canal. Okay, so it's a sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are different. These are all what are called merocrine glands. Up here. Sebaceous glands are holocrine glands. And they are found, or they are associated with, hair follicles. And they produce sebum. And sebum lubricates the skin and the hair. It's also what leads to acne. So when those sebaceous glands get clogged, right, you can get whiteheads or blackheads forming, and then you can get bacteria feeding upon those. So you can actually get a bacteria infection in the sebaceous glands. So this is what is associated with acne. Okay, so they're holocrine in the fact that they do not secrete their substance via exocytosis, but rather the cells fragment. And so sebum also contains fragments of the cells of the gland. So the cells that line the gland have to constantly undergo mitosis in order to replace those glands. Okay. So if we look at, oops. Okay, so if we look at the surface of the skin, you need to be able to identify on this skin diagram the difference between the eccrine and the sebaceous glands. So you'll notice here that the eccrine glands are right here. These are exocrine glands because you notice that they have this little pore, right? This little duct that delivers the sweat to the surface of the skin. And then right here, you'll notice surrounding the hair follicles, that would be the sebaceous gland. And so the sebaceous gland produces the oils that are on our skin. And so oftentimes also when we bathe, right, we remove those natural oils and then we have to replace them with like lotions and other oil and conditioner, right, because we've removed the natural oils on the surface of the skin. So here's a diagram that shows a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about hair in a minute. But here's the hair duct, and then this is the gland. So you can see the individual cells in the gland with the nucleus, right? And then this is where they're kind of starting to fragment, and then they would release their substances, and it comes up through the hair follicles. Okay, so this is a diagram that's not in your book, but I think earwax is really interesting. When you look at earwax, one of the interesting things about it is that it is actually removed from the ear via cell migration. So you have these epithelial cells here, and they actually will start to migrate out here, and with them, they actually carry the sebum. So the problem comes when you use those Q-tips, right? And you push the sebum up against your tympanic membrane, and then it gets stuck there, so that the migration of the cells actually cannot move it out. And that's when you have to go to the doctor, you know, and they use that little microscope, and they just start to yell at you because they can see that you've used the Q-tip, right? I've been there. You've used the Q-tip, and they're like, ha, I can see the little indentation of the Q-tip on your earwax, right? And so then they will remove it. Okay. Does anybody else have earwax issues? No?
I have a friend who does.
Yeah.
She has to do those like wax things.
Yeah, where you heat them up and it draws it out. The warm water flushing feels really good in the doctor's office.
What are those things called?
The what? I don't know. They're called ear wicking. I don't know. I don't know if they really work. One of the things that I've noticed is that like when I have a fever, all of a sudden my earwax just starts flowing out. Does anybody else notice this when I'm sick, you know? And I think it's because it heats it up. So I think that what happens is you're heating up the earwax and it is making it more fluid, and so it's more likely to come out.
So if you just put hot water in it,
well, the problem is that you know, they always say you should do that with the doctor doing it, but I don't know. I guess you could put hot water everywhere. No, what I'm saying is the ears naturally clean themselves, right? Unless you start to mess with it and it gets like, I don't know, sometimes the earwax gets all clogged up into these big, you know, bunches like this. And so when you go to the doctor, they get like, you know, pinky size, you know, jammed up earwax out of your ear. Okay. So normally the earwax just naturally migrates out, okay, of the ear. But it becomes a problematic, I guess, if you produce too much earwax or if you mess with it too much, then it will stop. It's good to have earwax, yes, because the earwax is antimicrobial. So imagine like if you got, this helps protect against swimmer's ear. So if you get water in your ear, like you've been swimming in a lake or maybe even a swimming pool where there might be some bacteria, and then the bacteria start to reproduce here, and then you get an external ear infection, and you have to put antibiotics in there. So the earwax actually helps so that we don't always have these ear infections going on, the external ear infection, not the middle or the internal ear. Okay, so cerumen is good. Okay, so when we look at damage to the skin, one thing that we can note is what happens when we get burns on the skin. And we actually talked about sunburns, right, which can actually damage the skin and can actually lead to first-degree burns, which are epidermal in origin, okay? So if we look at the degree, this looks at the severity, right? So we can say first-degree burns which can abbreviate it as first degree, right, burns, are epidermis only. So this is where it gets red, right? And it might slough off a little bit. But you don't get any blistering. So that would be like a regular sunburn. That would be like a regular sunburn, would be a first degree burn, okay? The second degree burn, so I'll just put second degree, is where it's epidermis and some of the dermis. So this tends to cause blistering, right? Where the epidermis, you get actually a bubble of fluid between the epidermis and the dermis, right? So the blister is just a bubble of extracellular or interstitial fluid. Okay. And then the worst type of burns are the third degree, where they are full thickness of burns. Right? So when you have full thickness burns, something really interesting happens in that the skin cannot regenerate itself. And so in this particular instance, you have to graft new skin into this area, or you have to use what they call synthetic skin. So there's been some development of synthetic skin to treat burns specifically, like in the military. So we have to, these cannot repair themselves. And you must use a skin graft. Now, one of the biggest dangers of these full thickness burns is infection, because remember, the skin provides a barrier. So you have infection problems, but you also have loss of fluids. And so the skin actually helps to prevent water loss. And so you have infections are common with this one, right? And dehydration due to water loss across the surface of the body. Okay, so full thickness means that it is the epidermis and the dermis are gone, right? So full thickness burns. So in your book, there's a picture of these, the difference. And so this is somebody who may have burned their hand on a pan, for example. So you have the first degree burn where it's just red, the second degree burn where you have first and second degree burns on the palm. And then this would be a full thickness of the skin. So notice that the dermis has also been burned through. Okay. So that is super dangerous and super serious, right? Okay, so we're going to talk about hair and nails, because hair and nails are said to be the appendages of the skin. So we'll talk about skin appendages. So this includes hair and nails. Hair is actually believed to be evolved or derived from modified scales. If we look at scales, like on lizards, if we look at feathers on birds, if we look at hair on mammals, all of those have the same origin. And their production is actually determined by very similar genes that are thought to be, have evolved way back in time. So when we look at hair, we can see that we have a shaft, and then we have the root. And this makes up the hair follicle. Actually, no, the root part, sorry, makes up the hair follicle. Actually, the whole thing, sorry, hair follicle. Okay. So the shaft extends above the skin. The root actually goes down into the dermis. And so the hair originates in the dermis, not in the epidermis. So in the root, we have the hair bulb with hair matrix. And the hair matrix is where we have cells that are undergoing mitosis. So your hair has a lifespan. It grows, in some cases, it grows maybe and then it dies after a month. And that would be the short hair on the surface of your skin. So the reason why the hair on your eyebrows does not get as long as the hair on your scalp is that it has a shorter growing and lifespan. So it will grow for like 40 days and then it'll go into a resting and then it dies and then it is shed. So we're constantly shedding hair follicles into the environment. Some people can grow their hair for long periods of time and can get really long hair. Other people, their hair, even if they just let it grow, they don't have, the lifespan isn't as great. And so if you did never cut your hair, you know, it might be like here versus down to your butt, right? But that just has to do with genetic differences and how long your life cycle of your hair is. Okay. So if we look at the hair matrix, this is what has the stem cells that undergo mitosis and become the keratinized dead cells that make up the hair. So remember that keratin is a structural protein that we find in our skin. The keratin in the hair is a little bit different. It's a little stronger than the keratin that we see in the surface of the skin. We also see a harder keratin in our nails than we do in the surface of our skin. Okay, so but it's keratinized means that they produce a lot of keratin and then they've subsequently died, and that is what is actually making up the structure. So the hair that you see doesn't contain living cells. So those are just dead cells. So if we look at a diagram that shows this image of this, so this is from your textbook, you can see the hair shaft and then the hair root, and then we have the hair bulb, and then associated with the hair bulb are these cells that are located right here, and these are the hair matrix. And so they're going to reproduce, and then they're going to migrate up, and so the hair is going to grow out, okay? And you'll also see in this diagram the sebaceous gland, but there's another structure there that is called the erector pili. And the erector pili is smooth muscle. So that means that it is not under voluntary control, but this is what actually causes the hair to stand on end. So sometimes we experience this as goosebumps. So when our hair stands on end and this muscle contracts, it actually causes the skin to kind of dimple a little bit, and you can actually see the bumps, right? So that's what causes hair bumps. Or goosebumps. And then if you think about it in dogs, whenever they get really angry, the hair on their back will actually stand up, or cats, right? And that is also the erector pili muscles. Now the erector pili muscles are actually really important in thermoregulation of animals like cats and dogs, because when if they're really cold, you'll notice that animals get fluffy. And the reason why they get fluffy is that their hair or their feathers stand up. And that actually creates an airspace which is insulative. So you get kind of a warm pocket of air that is next to the surface of the skin, so it decreases the loss of heat. So it's actually important in thermoregulation in organisms other than us. It's kind of like we have hair all over our body that we can't see, right, very well, but we can feel it, and it stands on end, but it doesn't really serve that function. We get goosebumps from our cold, but doesn't really help. Okay, so this causes, this is connected to the hair follicle. Also remember that there's melanocytes that produce melanin, that give its hair the different color and the different amount of melanin. If you produce lots of melanin, you'll be dark haired. If you produce pheomelanin, you will have red hair. Okay, so nails are also considered to be an appendage, a skin appendage. And so when we look at the structure of the nail, it is actually the epidermis that makes up the nail. And when you look at the cuticle that is closest to the finger, most proximal to the finger, this is where the epidermis is being produced. And so when we look at the nails, they are dead epidermal cells produced by, we talked about the hair matrix. This is the nail matrix. Okay. So at the ends of your nails, these are cells that have started near the white part of your finger and have migrated. So it kind of is produced and they migrate and then generally cut them off, right? So if we look at a structure of this, or a diagram of this, okay. So this is the epidermis, and it kind of folds in, and this is the nail matrix. And so the individual cells are produced here, and then they migrate in this direction. And then you'll also notice that underneath the nail bed, we have blood vessels, and this is what actually gives the nail bed its coloration, right? Its pinkish hue and so sometimes when blood circulation is cut off, your nails will turn blue, right? Because blood has been shunted away from that particular area. And so this just is a protective covering for the ends of our fingers and toes. And it is the exact same in the fingers as in the toenails, but the fingernails actually grow faster. You probably have realized that when you're cutting them, you usually have to cut your fingernails more frequently than the toenails. Okay, and so this is epidermal, right? Dead keratinized cells, and then underneath where these blood vessels is, this is the dermis. And so that's why it hurts so much when you have to remove the nail, because what you're exposing is that very sensitive dermal tissue. Okay, so we are actually going to start on the next chapter, which has, oh, questions?
What chapter was this?
This was chapter 5. Okay. So we were talking about connective tissues, but I did not mention the different cartilages. And we didn't talk in my lecture very much about the bone. And so, right, we're going to kind of start on the skeletal system, and we'll talk about the cartilages first. So what is the most abundant cartilage that we have in our body, do you think? Hyaline. Somebody said that back there. So this is hyaline. Okay. So hyaline cartilage is characterized by chondrocytes that are in kind of a glassy matrix. So you have all, if you've eaten chicken, for example, this would be at the ends of the bones, that white kind of gristly stuff, right? When you're eating a chicken bone, that would be hyaline cartilage. Okay. The matrix consists of collagen only, so only has collagen fibers. So remember that collagen is a type of structural protein that is also found in bone and found in other connective tissues as well, but it provides its tensile strength, okay? So when we look at the different areas where we see hyaline cartilage, one would be the trachea. So we have the tracheal rings, right? So you can feel those, right? Your trachea is actually anterior to your esophagus. And so you can feel the tracheal rings, and that is the support for the trachea. And those are hyaline. We also have costal cartilages. And what do you think that means? What does costal mean? Ribs. Right? So some of the ribs are connected via hyaline cartilage to the sternum, right? So the sternum is bone, but the connection of those lower ribs to the sternum is via hyaline cartilage. We also have nasal cartilages, right? So that's the nose, obviously. So this is, if you feel your nose, that is a hyaline cartilage, okay? It's different cartilage than what we have in our ear, which is actually elastic cartilage. So the ear, the external ear, is not hyaline cartilage. Okay, we also have articular cartilages. So that's articular. So when we talk about articulations, that is, there's an R on there, that is where bones come together. Where they articulate is where they come together. And so on the ends of all of our bones and joints, not like the skull bones don't have this, but most of our bones that have joints that move, we have hyaline cartilage. So this is the end of the bones. And it's extremely important because it allows for rather friction-free movements between the bones. So we don't have hard, bony bones rubbing against one another. So when you get older and you get osteoarthritis, that generally means that your articular cartilage, like in your knees, will start to degrade, and then you'll get bone rubbing on bone. And so that's a really bad and painful thing, and it usually could result in having your knees replaced with synthetic structures that won't have that problem. Okay, so if we look at a diagram of these skeletal cartilages, hyaline cartilage is always designated as blue. Okay, so here you can see the costal cartilages, the nasal cartilages, the articular cartilages on the ends of the bones, right? And then the trachea, which also includes the larynx and your voice box, are also hyaline cartilage. Okay. Elastic cartilage is actually found in only 2 locations. So if we look at elastic cartilage has both collagen and elastic fibers. So it is located in the external ear and also in the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is a structure that prevents food from getting into our trachea. So it sits on the opening called the glottis. And so when we swallow, the food actually pushes this kind of the structure down so that the food bypasses and goes into the esophagus and not into your trachea. But then it bounces right back, right? So it's kind of a mechanical valve, and so it needs to be elastic. So when you bend it, it doesn't stay bent, it bounces back. And so that is the characteristic of that elastic cartilage. The fibrocartilages are those kind of specialized cartilage that needs to be a little bit stronger, and it can be found in the intervertebral discs, the menisci of the knee. So if we look at fibrocartilage, this is the intervertebral discs. Right? Also the menisci of the knee. And as well as the pubic symphysis. Right? So you might have heard of the knee meniscus, because this is the cartilage that tends to get ripped or torn during knee injuries. And it actually just makes, well, we'll talk about the knee when we get to the joints. And then the pubic symphysis is between the two pubic bones. And this is a really kind of an important joint, specifically in females, because that pubic symphysis actually starts to get relaxed a little bit during childbirth and labor. And so it kind of allows for a widening of the pelvis so that the fetal head can move down through the birth canal. So those are fibrocartilages. Okay, so we looked at some of these in lab, right? The histology of them. So histology just means tissue, right? So remember that we have these cells, chondrocytes, and then in the matrix, this would be collagen fibers. Remember, there's also ground substance, proteoglycans, right? The elastic, right, had dark elastic fibers that you could actually see. So it looked different histologically from the hyaline cartilage. And then we had the, we actually didn't look at fibrocartilage, but this is a diagram of fibrocartilage that shows lots of matrix, lots of collagen fibers, large collagen fibers that actually make it a little bit stronger. Okay. So I wanted to talk about bone histology, and so I'm going to give you this little handout. And so this should be kind of a review for what we talked about in lecture, what you saw in the microscope. It's in February, second week of February, February 13th, maybe? Okay. So actually, let's look at the back side of that first. And it should look something like this. So this is actually, right, a long bone. We're going to talk about the structure of the long bone. But the long bone, if you look at a cross section of it, it has this weird looking bone that is actually referred to as spongy bone. So I'm going to put a little line there and I'm going to say that this is spongy bone. And notice that it has blood vessels in red and blue. You don't have that on your diagrams, but and then the yellow would be the nerve tissue. So bone is a living tissue that has to have blood supply, and it also has to have nervous stimuli to it. Now the little bars in the spongy bone are actually called trabeculae. So I'll put spongy bone with trabeculae. Okay, so these are like the iron-like grids right here. So if you were thinking about like how this would be like maybe the structure of a building, the spongy bone is very strong because of the trabeculae, and it is also more lightweight than if our bone was solid, right? So this is kind of like the girders. Is that the right word? On a steel building, you know what I'm trying to talk about, the framework of a steel building, right? The girders, or maybe of a bridge, right? Okay, so this provides a strength, but lightweight. If our bones were solid, that would be a problem, right? They would be too heavy. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at birds' bones are so interesting because they have a lot of the spongy bone and just a little bit of the compact bone, and that makes them even lighter weight for flight. So this type of, this type of bone right here is what is referred to as compact bone. And it has another name. It's called lamellar bone. Okay. And it's called lamellar because of the rings. So notice that there are these circular structures in the bone. And does anybody remember what one of these circular structures is called from your lab? The lamellae are actually the circles going around, but like one of these units, but you're good, you're close. One of these units. Osteon, excellent. Okay, so that's one osteon. And in the center of the osteon, we have what? The central canal. So the central canal delivers nutrients. Now these rings right here would be the lamellae. And remember that the collagen fibers go in different directions in the different lamellae to give the bone even more strength. Okay. So turning your page over. Okay. This would also be the central canal. What are these cells that are found within the spaces called lacunae called? Osteocytes. So these would be osteocytes within lacunae. And so the lacunae are spaces, but they're different from the matrix because the matrix is hard. And so the cells wouldn't be able to live in a solidified matrix. And so they need space to live in. And those are called the lacunae. And then this would also be the lamellae, right? So it's just showing one little unit of that, but not the whole osteon, just one little ring around. Okay. So if we look at the matrix of bone, it is the collagen that gives it its strength. And it is the calcium phosphate salts that give it its brittleness, right? Hardness. Oops, salts. So there's kind of an interesting experiment you could do, I've done before, where you take chicken bones and you put them in vinegar and you put them in your refrigerator. And then every few days you just keep changing out the vinegar because the vinegar will start to kind of become diluted. And then what happens is that you completely decalcify the bone. So you'll end up with a chicken bone that rather than being hard and brittle, you could actually take the chicken bone and actually bend it in half, right? And that's because you've removed all of the salts and that all that is left is the collagen fibers. And so you can bend the bone and it doesn't snap, right? So that's the collagen gives it that tensile strength. The calcium phosphate gives it the hardness, right? The ability to kind of support us upright against gravity, and then also being able to move the bones in relationship to one another. Okay, so thinking of bone as living tissue. So we're going to talk more about bone when we get to bone histology, when we get to bone development. Because all of our bones actually start out as hyaline cartilage, and then they're subsequently replaced by bone. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about the classification of bones. And so we can talk about bones as being, we can classify them as being flat bones, right? So flat bones include the skull bones. So the ones that we learned, like the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, I'm hoping that you guys are kind of studying this every day, remember? So those are flat bones, and they actually have a little bit of a different structure than the long bones. So when we look at the flat bones, they have compact bone on each side, and then inside they have these spaces. And so it kind of looks like this, right? Those spaces. But they don't have trabeculae. They have a different, it's called something else. So I'll make this a little bit bigger, right? So the spaces in the flat bones are called diploe. And it's kind of weird, E. I'm not sure why it's called this, but it's that E with the little 2 dots over it. And so this diploe are the spaces. Oops, are the spaces in the flat bones. Okay, I'll show you a picture of that in a second. Okay, we also have long bones. We have lots of long bones in our body. So like obviously the humerus, but also the radius, the ulna, and of the hands, the bones that even make up our palm, which would be the metacarpals. Okay, so those are just some examples of long bones. When we look at when we look at bones, sometimes we have short bones. It seems so silly, the classification, but this is from your book. Okay, we have short bones and long bones. So short bones are like the carpal bones, and maybe the bones in your ankles. So these are considered to be short bones. So carpal bones, wrist bones, ankle bones, considered short. Okay, then we have irregular bones. Right, and so these are bones that have lots of processes coming off of them and are maybe have holes in them. And so a good example of this would be the vertebrae. Right, so the vertebrae are irregular because they have a foramen, which is a hole, and then they have transverse processes coming off to the sides, and then they have a spinous process coming off, right? And so they are very weirdly shaped. Okay. What do you think your clavicle would be? Long bone. Right? That would be a long bone. Yeah, question?
So like the irregular.
Yes, so those weird hip bones, the ilium, which makes up like part of your coxal bone, that would probably be irregular as well. Okay, so in your book, they have a discussion of this. Okay. So long bones, humerus, flat bones, they use not the skull, but the sternum is also a flat bone. Irregular bone, the vertebrae, short bone. This is the talus in the foot, which articulates with the tibia and the fibula in the forelimb, or in the bottom half of the limb. Oops. I just realized I've been recording the wrong thing. Been recording this, which kind of looks at that. Oops. Okay, so now I'm back. Okay, so let's look at the functions of the bones. Okay, so one function is protection. Give me an example of how the bony skeleton protects structures. Ribs, right? So you have this thoracic cage. And it always amazes me because you think of the thoracic cage and your hips as being kind of wide apart, but if you try to find the bottom of your rib cage and the top of your hip, there's like, for me, there's like that much space between my top of my hip and the bottom of my rib cage. So the thoracic cage protects the heart and the lungs. Oops, thoracic. Right. And the pelvis actually also protects quite a bit of organs. So it would like protect our bladder, and also our reproductive organs are down there in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. Another good example is obviously the skull and the vertebral column. Right? So this protects the nervous system. We also have support. Right? So this allows us, for example, to stand upright against gravity. Right? So this would be like the spine, upright spine. Right? We have movement. So that with the help of skeletal muscles that attach to the bones, this can allow movement at the joints. So where the bones articulate would be movement at the joints. And then we also have mineral storage. So what mineral do we have in our bones that we could store and we could actually take out of the bone if we need to? Calcium, right? So calcium is a big place. Right? So that's why, for example, when you're pregnant, they say take calcium because your body, if you don't have enough calcium to help with the development of the fetus, the body will take calcium out of your bones, right? And then the bones will become less likely to withstand breakage. And we'll talk about osteoporosis, but when you are drained of calcium, then the bones become weaker, okay? And then this is kind of an interesting one. They have an endocrine function. Okay. Endocrine means that they produce hormones. This is new. I'm not even sure it's in your book. Okay. Probably in this edition, actually. But they just discovered that the skeleton actually has an endocrine function. So what their hormones produce and what those hormones do is kind of still being investigated. This is not something that we thought that the skeletal system did. Okay. We also have blood production. Right? So we have inside the bones, we have what is called red bone marrow. And this includes or has stem cells that give rise to all blood cells. So the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, the white blood cells, the leukocytes, the platelets, right, are all produced by the bone, and it's in the red bone marrow. Okay. The other thing that it does is we have the storage of triglycerides. And you might think, oh, triglycerides are stored in adipose tissue, right? Those are fats. But most of as adults, our red bone marrow actually gets converted to yellow bone marrow. So the yellow bone marrow contains fat. So we can actually store some energy in our bones and the yellow bone marrow. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. So make sure that you get your lab notebook all put together, and then we'll have lab. We'll work more on the skeleton and on the skin, and then you'll turn your lab notebook into me at the end of lab. So have all of your handouts completed and filled out.
Yeah.
from lab. We can't make up for the lab by doing the handouts. Get them. Why don't we just run downstairs? Let me turn off my stuff.